Andrew Mountbatten Windsor walked into a police station in February 2026 and did something no senior British royal has done in centuries. He was arrested. Handcuffs were not used. There was no perp walk for the cameras. But the moment was still historic, still unprecedented, still the kind of thing that does not happen to people born this close to a throne. He was questioned on suspicion of misconduct in public office. He was released under investigation. Not charged. Not cleared. Just left in the grey space where reputations finish dying slowly instead of all at once. 4 months earlier, his own brother, the King of England, had taken his name. Not metaphorically. Legally. Officially. King Charles III issued a statement stripping his brother of the title Prince, the title Duke of York, the style His Royal Highness, the Order of the Garter, every honour that had ever been hung on him. The man who was once second in line to the throne of the United Kingdom became, on paper, a private citizen with a very famous last name, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. This is the part most people get wrong about royal power. They think a crown is permanent. They think blood is a kind of armour that nothing can pierce. Andrew was born the son of a queen. He served in the Falklands War. He flew helicopters into actual combat. He carried, for most of his life, the kind of public love that money cannot buy and an institution cannot manufacture. And none of it saved him. 500 years before Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was born, a Florentine writer named Machiavelli sat down and wrote a book about exactly this. Not about kindness, not about fairness, about how power is actually won, and kept, and lost. He called it The Prince, and inside it is a sentence that reads like it was written about a man who would not exist for another 5 centuries. He wrote that the prince who builds his entire position on the goodwill of others, on charm, on the assumption that people will always think well of him, is building on sand. The moment the wind changes, he wrote, that prince has nothing left to stand on. Andrew built his entire life on that sand. This is not a story about whether you feel sorry for him. This is not a story about politics, or the monarchy as an institution, or anyone's opinion about what should happen to him next. This is a story about mechanics. About exactly which moves a person in power can make that guarantee their own downfall, and how a man who had every possible advantage a human being can be born with still managed to lose every single one of them, one at a time, in a sequence Machiavelli described with frightening precision. If you've ever wondered how someone with that much protection, that much money, that much built-in public love can end up standing alone with none of it, stay with me, because the answer was written down 500 years ago, and it explains Andrew's fall almost line by line. And if you want to see exactly where the pattern repeats, in business, in politics, in your own life, subscribe now, because this channel exists to show you the mechanics underneath the headlines that everyone else just reacts to. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning is where the first mistake was made, decades before anyone outside the family noticed anything was wrong. Machiavelli wrote something in the 3rd chapter of The Prince that almost nobody quotes, because it sounds boring on the surface, but it is one of the most important warnings in the entire book. He wrote that a prince should never form an alliance with someone more powerful than himself unless he absolutely has no other choice. He wrote that doing so puts you at the mercy of that person's fortune. If they fall, you fall with them. And worse, if they are exposed, you are exposed simply by association, whether or not you did anything yourself. Andrew met Jeffrey Epstein in the early 1990s. The exact year has been disputed by different accounts inside his own circle, but what is not disputed is what Epstein already was by the time their friendship deepened. A man who collected access, who built his entire identity around being close to powerful people, and who used that closeness as currency. Andrew did not need Epstein's money. He did not need Epstein's houses, or his island, or his planes. He had access to more wealth and more comfort through his own family than Epstein could have ever offered him. So why stay close to a man like that for years, long after warning signs were visible to people far less protected than a prince? Machiavelli has an answer that is uncomfortable but consistent. He wrote that people in power often crave something even more than money. They crave an audience that makes them feel important in a way their normal life does not. Epstein was, by every account that has come out since, extraordinarily good at making powerful people feel like the most fascinating person in the room. He flattered, he listened, He made introductions. He created a world where men who were used to being surrounded by formality could relax into something that felt, falsely, like freedom. Andrew was a man with limited official duties, a marriage that had already ended, and a public reputation that the rest of his family had quietly decided was a liability. He was the spare wheel of an institution that runs almost entirely on the popularity of its working members. And into that gap walked a man who offered exactly the kind of attention a person in that position is most vulnerable to. This is the first mistake, and it is the one every single subsequent disaster grew out of. He aligned himself with someone whose downfall would always be bigger than his own ability to control the story. Machiavelli wrote that the wise prince calculates, before forming any close relationship, what happens to him if that relationship becomes public, contested, or catastrophic. Most people never run that calculation. They assume the relationship will stay exactly as comfortable and private as it feels in the moment. Epstein was arrested in 2006. Convicted in 2008 on charges related to soliciting prostitution from a minor. This was not hidden information. This was not a secret only revealed years later. It was public record, reported at the time, available to anyone who looked. And Andrew did not walk away. He stayed in contact. He visited Epstein's New York townhouse in December 2010, after the conviction. After the public knew exactly what Epstein had been found guilty of. Photographs from that visit exist. He described it later as the wrong decision, something he said he kicks himself over daily. But the decision had already been made, years earlier. And what happened in 2010 was not the cause of the disaster. It was simply the moment the disaster became impossible to deny. Machiavelli wrote something specific about timing that applies directly here. He said that injuries, when they are coming, should be dealt with all at once, decisively, before they have time to compound. He was talking about how a prince should handle threats to his own position. But the same principle works in reverse, as a warning. The threats you do not deal with decisively do not go away. They sit, quietly gathering weight, until the moment arrives when they cannot be managed anymore. Only survived badly. Andrew had years to make the clean break. 2006, 2008, every single year between the conviction and the disaster that followed had been a window where a different decision was possible. He took none of them. Now let's talk about November 2019, because this is the single most studied moment in the entire collapse. And it is also the moment that proves something Machiavelli was almost obsessive about throughout the entire book: the danger of believing your own image more than the actual evidence in front of you. Andrew sat down for an interview with the BBC's Newsnight programme, with journalist Emily Maitlis. 58 minutes, recorded in the picture gallery at Buckingham Palace. Multiple accounts from people close to the family say he believed, going into it, that this interview would clear his name. He reportedly gave the production team a tour of the palace afterward, pleased with how it had gone. The public reaction was the opposite of what he expected. It was described by people who covered it at the time as one of the worst public relations disasters in the modern history of the British monarchy, on the scale of the aftermath of Princess Diana's death. He said he had no recollection of meeting Virginia Giuffre, the woman who alleged he had assaulted her when she was 17. He offered an alibi involving a children's pizza restaurant. He said he did not sweat due to a medical condition. He said, about his own continued visits to Epstein after the conviction, that staying at the townhouse was, in his words, a convenient place to be. Machiavelli wrote, in the chapter on how a prince should avoid contempt, that nothing destroys a ruler faster than appearing inconsistent, indecisive, or detached from the reality everyone else can plainly see. He wrote that the prince must above all avoid being seen as the kind of man who cannot read a room, because the moment people see that, they stop being afraid of his power and start openly questioning it. That interview was not a scandal because of any single answer inside it. It was a disaster because of what it revealed about Andrew's relationship with reality. He believed the explanation would be received as reasonable. The public received it as the opposite. And once an audience decides a person is fundamentally out of touch with how their own behavior looks from the outside, there is almost no recovering the trust that requires. 4 days later, the palace announced he was stepping back from public duties. With the consent of his mother, the Queen, not by his own full initiative, the institution moved first, and he followed. This is the second principle from the prince, playing out almost word for word. Machiavelli wrote that the prince who is abandoned by the people around him because he has made himself a liability to their own survival is finished, regardless of how much they once protected him. An institution like the British monarchy does not run on love for one individual, it runs on its own continued existence. The moment Andrew became a threat to that existence rather than an asset to it, the family's loyalty, which had absorbed years of warning signs, reached its limit. By January 2020, a U.S. federal prosecutor stated publicly that Andrew had provided zero cooperation with the investigation into Epstein, despite saying in the Newsnight interview that he would be willing to help authorities if asked. The prosecutor said Andrew had repeatedly declined to schedule an interview, while his own representatives continued to claim publicly that he was eager to cooperate. Machiavelli wrote about exactly this kind of gap, the distance between what a prince says publicly and what he actually does, and he was specific about the danger in it. He said the prince can survive being seen as cautious. He can survive being seen as cunning, even ruthless, if the results justify it. But he cannot survive being caught saying one thing and doing another, in full public view, repeatedly, because once people catch that pattern, they stop believing anything else he says, even when he is telling the truth. This is where the slow collapse turned into something that could no longer be managed with statements and stepping back. Because once the public stops believing your statements, your only remaining currency is what you actually do. And what Andrew actually did, for years, according to the prosecutor's own public claims, was nothing. By 2022, a civil case brought by Virginia Giuffre had been settled for an undisclosed amount without any admission of wrongdoing. The settlement closed one legal door. It did not close the public one. If anything, it confirmed for most observers that there had been enough substance to the allegations to warrant resolving them rather than fighting them through to a verdict. And through all of this, here is the detail Machiavelli would have flagged as the deepest error of all. Andrew kept believing that his birth, his title, his lifetime inside the institution would ultimately protect him from consequences that would have ended an ordinary person's public life instantly. He was right, for a long time. The title held. The settlement was private. The family kept him inside the structure, diminished but not expelled. Machiavelli warned about exactly this kind of false security. He wrote that fortune favors the prince who acts boldly when the moment requires it, but abandons the prince who simply waits, assuming his position will protect him indefinitely. Waiting, he wrote, is not a strategy. It is the absence of one. And the prince who mistakes inherited protection for permanent protection is the prince who is the most surprised when that protection finally runs out. It ran out in October 2025. The statement from Buckingham Palace was unambiguous in a way that nothing in the previous 6 years had been. King Charles initiated a formal process to remove every style, title, and honor his brother held. The man who had once been His Royal Highness, the Duke of York, was now to be known, officially, permanently, as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. His lease on Royal Lodge, the residence that had given him a legal right to remain in his home in Windsor Great Park, was surrendered. The protection that title had given him, the one thing standing between him and being just another private citizen with a complicated past, was gone. Machiavelli wrote that the new ruler, when he takes decisive action against a threat to his own position, must make that action total and immediate, because half measures create more enemies than they remove. King Charles did not strip one title and leave the rest in place. He did not issue a warning and wait. He took everything in a single formal action, communicated publicly, with no ambiguity left for anyone to exploit. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was a king protecting an institution that had absorbed 6 years of damage because of his brother's refusal to remove himself from the situation voluntarily. Machiavelli would have recognized the calculation immediately. The king had reached the point where his brother's continued presence inside the institution was costing the institution more than his brother's anger at being removed from it. Once that calculation flips, the outcome is no longer in question. It only becomes a matter of when. And 4 months after that, in February 2026, came the arrest. The first time in centuries a senior member of the British royal family had been taken in by police on suspicion of a crime. Questioned, released under investigation, neither charged nor cleared. Left exactly where Machiavelli said the abandoned prince always ends up, not destroyed in a single dramatic moment, but stripped piece by piece until there is nothing structural left holding him up. This is where we'll pause for now. Because what comes next, the part most people never look at closely, the years of small decisions that built toward this exact ending, the specific moments where a different choice was sitting right in front of him and he walked past it every single time, that is where the real lesson in this story lives. Not in the scandal itself, in the mechanics underneath it. Let's go back to a decision most people have never even heard about, because it happened quietly, years before the Newsnight interview, and it tells you everything about how Andrew actually thought about risk. In March 2011, his own private secretary, a man named Alastair Watson, who had served Andrew for 9 years, wrote a letter to the Times. Not a leak, not a tabloid sting, a letter, on the record, correcting the public timeline of when Andrew had met Epstein. Andrew himself had described the friendship as something that started later, something more distant. His own former secretary, a man who had spent nearly a decade inside his office, was putting a different version on the record. Machiavelli wrote that a prince should be especially careful about the people closest to him, because they are the only ones with enough proximity to contradict him publicly and be believed. He said the loyalty of a secretary or an advisor is not permanent. It lasts only as long as serving the prince serves the advisor's own reputation. The moment continuing to protect the prince starts costing the advisor something, that loyalty has a shelf life, and it expires. Andrew had spent years describing the Epstein relationship as occasional, distant, almost incidental, probably once or twice a year, he said. And here was someone who had watched him from the inside, willing to put his name to a different story while Andrew was still actively managing his own narrative. This is the kind of detail that gets buried under the bigger headlines, but it matters, because it shows the pattern was never really about one bad night in 2019. It was about a man who had been quietly losing control of his own story for the better part of a decade, in small increments, while believing he still had it. Now here's something that almost never gets mentioned, and it's one of the more interesting structural facts in this entire situation. Despite everything, despite the stripped titles, despite the eviction from Royal Lodge, despite the arrest, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor did not disappear from the line of succession. As of early 2026, he remained 8th in line to the throne. Behind William and his 3 children, behind Harry and his 2 children, but still on the list. Removing him entirely would require an act of Parliament, not a family decision, not a palace statement. Actual legislation, debated and passed, and likely requiring cooperation from other Commonwealth nations like Canada and Australia, where the British monarch is still head of state. A YouGov poll found that 82% of the British public believed he should be removed from the line of succession entirely, and still, as of the most recent reporting, he remained on it. Not because anyone believes he will ever be king. He will not. But because removing a person from a 600-year-old legal structure is not as simple as removing a man from a guest list. Machiavelli actually wrote about this exact kind of situation, the gap between what a population wants and what the formal structure of power allows to happen quickly. He warned that the prince in charge should never assume public sentiment translates instantly into institutional change. Institutions move slowly by design, he said, because the people who built them wanted them to survive moments of public anger, not bend to every one of them. King Charles could strip titles with a single statement because titles are within his personal gift. He could not erase his brother from the succession with the same stroke of a pen, because that power was never his alone to use. This tells you something important about the entire collapse. Andrew lost almost everything that depended on goodwill, reputation, and family discretion, all of which moved fast once the decision was made. He kept the one thing that depended on hard legal structure, because hard legal structure does not move at the speed of public anger. It moves at the speed of Parliament. Now, let's talk about money, because this is where the fall becomes almost uncomfortably literal, and where another Machiavelli principle becomes impossible to ignore. Before October 2025, Andrew received a private allowance from King Charles, reportedly around £1 million a year, paid not from public funds, but from the king's own personal income through the Duchy of Lancaster. After the title strip, that allowance was cut. His private security, which Charles had also been funding personally, after Andrew lost his taxpayer-funded protection back in 2022, was withdrawn as well. He was moved out of Royal Lodge, a 30-room mansion in Windsor Great Park, into a smaller property. Machiavelli wrote something specific about princes who depend entirely on someone else's generosity rather than their own independent base of resources. He said that dependence of that kind is the most fragile position a person in power can occupy, because it means your entire standard of living exists only as long as the person funding it chooses to keep funding it. The moment their interest in protecting you changes, everything built on top of that funding collapses at the same speed the decision was made. Andrew had spent his entire adult life inside a financial structure that flowed from the institution itself. He had never built an independent base of wealth or independent legitimacy the way some royals attempt to through business ventures, charitable platforms, or public reinvention. His failed entrepreneurial initiative, Pitch at Palace, lost its corporate sponsors within days of the Newsnight fallout, when KPMG and Standard Chartered both pulled their support. That was the one significant attempt he had made at building something that existed outside the family structure, and it dissolved the moment the family's protection of him became too costly for outside companies to be associated with. This is the exact trap Machiavelli warned against. The prince who has no independent foundation, who exists entirely as an extension of someone else's goodwill, has no fallback position when that goodwill is withdrawn. There was no version of Andrew that existed separately from being a senior royal. When that version was taken away, there was nothing underneath it to stand on. Compare that, for a moment, to how other members of complicated royal lives have handled similar reputational threats. Prince Harry, whatever you think of his choices, built an independent financial and public life outside the institution before his relationship with it became strained. Whether that was foresight or simply circumstance, it meant that when his own relationship with the family became difficult, he had something to land on that did not depend on the crown's continued approval. Andrew had nothing like that. 65 years old, and his entire identity, financial security, and public relevance had only ever existed inside one structure. When that structure decided he had become more liability than asset, there was no second foundation underneath him. Machiavelli's word for this kind of prince was specific. He called him a prince who exists by fortune rather than by his own virtue, meaning his own independent capability. Fortune gave Andrew his position at birth. He never built anything underneath it that fortune alone hadn't provided. And the prince who relies entirely on fortune, Machiavelli wrote, is the prince who collapses completely the moment fortune turns, because he never built anything of his own that could survive the turn. There is one more piece of this that deserves attention, because it is the part that even people who followed the story closely tend to miss. The insider reporting from early 2026 describes Andrew as furious, convinced his brother is engaged in a deliberate effort to erase him and the entire York branch of the family from royal history. Whether or not that's an accurate read of Charles's intentions, what it reveals is something Machiavelli wrote about extensively. The prince who has lost his position rarely interprets his own fall as the result of his own decisions. He interprets it as betrayal, conspiracy, persecution by people who were always against him. Machiavelli was almost contemptuous of this pattern in rulers he studied throughout history. He wrote that the prince who blames fortune or enemies or betrayal for his own downfall, rather than examining his own conduct, guarantees he will never recover his position, because a man who refuses to see his own role in his collapse cannot make the changes that would prevent the next one. This is the most important lesson buried inside the entire Andrew story, and it has nothing to do with royalty specifically. It applies to anyone who has ever lost a position, a relationship, a reputation, and chosen to believe the loss was something done to them rather than something they built, decision by decision, over years. So what is the actual mechanism underneath all of this? What turns a man with every possible advantage into a cautionary tale studied 500 years after the book that predicted his exact pattern was written? It is this. Power that depends entirely on inherited protection and the goodwill of others is the most fragile kind of power that exists, because it can be withdrawn by someone else's decision, at someone else's timing, for someone else's reasons. The only power that survives contact with a real crisis is power you built yourself, independent of any single person's continued approval. Andrew never built that. He inherited a title, inherited an income, inherited an institution's protection, and made decision after decision, believing that inheritance would always be enough to absorb whatever came next. For years it was. The friendship with Epstein, sustained long after the conviction made it indefensible. The 2019 interview, where he believed his own explanation would be received the way he intended it. The years of declining to cooperate with investigators while his representatives publicly claimed the opposite. Each one of these was a moment where a different choice was available. And at each one, he chose to trust that his position would protect him rather than confronting the actual risk in front of him. Machiavelli's entire book is built on one core idea that explains every single chapter of this story. The world does not reward the prince who is liked. It rewards the prince who sees reality clearly and acts on what he actually sees, rather than on what his position has always allowed him to assume. Andrew saw the warning signs as early as 2006, when Epstein was first arrested. He saw them again in 2008, at the conviction. He saw them in 2010, when he visited the townhouse anyway. He saw them in 2019, when the interview he believed would clear him instead ended his public life. He saw them in 2020, when prosecutors said publicly that his promised cooperation never materialized. Every single one of those moments was a clear signal, and every single one was met with the same response. Trust the position. Trust the inheritance. Assume it holds. It held for 19 years. And then, across 4 months in late 2025 and early 2026, it stopped holding all at once. That is not bad luck. Machiavelli would not have called it bad luck, and neither should we. It is what happens, with total predictability, when a person spends 2 decades treating warnings as background noise instead of decision points. The fall did not happen in October 2025. It happened in 2006, in the moment a different decision was available and was not taken, and it simply took 19 years for that original decision to finish working its way through to its conclusion. That's the part worth sitting with. Not the scandal, the mechanics. The exact moment, years before anyone outside the family was watching, where the entire ending was already written, and all that was left was the time it would take to arrive. Here's the part that actually matters most, the part that turns this from a story about one man into something you can use, because if you strip away the palace, the title, the crown, what you're left with is a pattern that repeats everywhere power exists, in companies, in relationships, in careers, in families that have nothing to do with royalty at all. Machiavelli wrote The Prince as a manual, not a tragedy. He wasn't interested in making you feel sorry for rulers who lost everything. He was interested in showing you exactly which decisions caused the loss, so you could recognize the same decisions before you make them yourself. So let's pull the actual lessons out of Andrew's collapse, one at a time. The way Machiavelli intended this kind of analysis to be used. The first lesson is about who you stay close to once the warning signs are visible. Andrew's relationship with Epstein did not become a problem in 2019. It became a problem in 2006, the year Epstein was first arrested, and it stayed a problem every single year after that, in plain public view, while Andrew kept the friendship running anyway. Machiavelli's warning here is brutally simple. The people you associate with become part of your own risk profile the moment their problems become public, not later. Immediately, waiting to see if it blows over is itself the decision, and it is almost always the wrong one. Apply that to your own life, and it stops being a royal scandal and starts being something closer to a personal audit. Who are you still close to, professionally or personally, whose problems you've been quietly hoping will resolve themselves without you having to make a decision about the relationship? Machiavelli's answer is that hope is not a strategy. The moment the risk becomes visible is the moment to act, not the moment to wait and see. The second lesson is about what happens when you trust your own explanation more than the evidence sitting in front of you. The Newsnight interview destroyed Andrew not because of a single damning fact, but because he walked in believing his version would land the way he intended it. And it didn't even come close. He misjudged the room by an almost unbelievable margin. Machiavelli's word for this is contempt, the thing a leader earns the instant people realize he has lost touch with how he actually appears to everyone outside his own head. This happens constantly outside of royal scandals. It happens any time someone explains away a mistake with an explanation that makes perfect sense to them, and to absolutely nobody else listening. The lesson isn't to never explain yourself, it's to test your version against reality before you stake your reputation on it. Because the gap between how you think you sound and how you actually sound is usually much larger than you assume. The third lesson is about independence. Andrew never built anything that existed outside the institution that made him who he was. No separate income, no separate platform, no separate reputation. When the institution decided to cut him off, there was nothing underneath him. Machiavelli called this the fatal weakness of the prince, who rules by fortune instead of by his own capability. Fortune gives you a position. It does not protect that position. Only something you built yourself can do that. This is by far the most useful lesson in the entire story, because it has nothing to do with being royal and everything to do with being human. Anyone whose entire income, identity, and security depends on one employer, one relationship, one institution. One person's continued goodwill is standing exactly where Andrew was standing before the fall. It might hold for years. It held for Andrew for decades. But the moment it stops holding, there's nothing underneath to catch you, and you find that out at the worst possible time, not the best one. The fourth lesson is about how fast formal power moves compared to public anger. 82% of the country wanted him removed from the line of succession entirely, and as of the most recent reporting, he was still on it, because removing him required parliament, not outrage. Machiavelli's point here cuts both ways. If you're the one trying to remove a threat, understand that institutions move slowly and plan for that. And if you're the one hoping an institution will protect you forever simply because changing things is hard, understand that slow does not mean permanent. It just means you have more time than you think before the structure finally catches up to the sentiment. And the final lesson is the one Machiavelli seemed to care about more than any other in the entire book. The prince who blames betrayal, conspiracy, or bad luck for his own downfall, instead of examining his own decisions, is the prince who guarantees there will be a second downfall, because he never actually learned anything from the first one. The reporting on Andrew in early 2026 describes a man convinced his own brother is trying to erase him out of malice, rather than a man reckoning with 2 decades of decisions that built, brick by brick, toward exactly this outcome. Machiavelli would have seen that immediately as the real tragedy in this story. Not the lost title, not the lost house, the lost opportunity to actually understand what happened and why. Here's the honest summary of everything we've walked through. A man born with more inherited protection than almost anyone on Earth, spent 2 decades treating early warning signs as background noise, trusted his own explanations over the evidence in front of him, built nothing independent of the institution that defined him, and ended up, at 66 years old, stripped of his name, his home, his income, and very nearly his place in his own family's history. Not because of one bad night, because of 19 years of decisions that all pointed the same direction, decision after decision, until the ending simply arrived on schedule. Machiavelli wrote The Prince in 1513, about rulers in Italian city-states who have been dead for half a millennium, and somehow the exact mechanics he described still explain, almost word for word, how a prince born in Buckingham Palace in 1960 ended up exactly where he is now. The technology changes, the clothes change, the names change. The mechanics of how power is built, protected, and lost do not change at all. But there's a piece of this we haven't looked at yet, and it might be the most important piece of all. Because so far we've talked about Andrew as if his fall happened in isolation, one man making bad decisions in a vacuum. It didn't. Every fall like this has a structure around it. The advisors who saw it coming and said nothing, or said something and were ignored. The institution that protected him long after protecting him stopped making sense. And underneath all of it, the man who built his entire fortune and his entire life around being extraordinarily good at exploiting exactly this kind of weakness in exactly this kind of person. To understand how Andrew fell, you actually have to understand the man who wrote the book 500 years before any of this happened, and why he understood power so completely. Because Machiavelli wasn't a theorist sitting in a comfortable study, imagining how power might work. He lost everything himself, the same way Andrew did, and that's exactly why he saw it coming. Let's go there next. Here's the revised ending for C, replacing the final subscribe and comment closing so it opens into D, instead of wrapping up. Replace the last 3 paragraphs of C with this, but there's a piece of this we haven't looked at yet, and it might be the most important piece of all. Because so far we've talked about Andrew as if his fall happened in isolation, one man making bad decisions in a vacuum. It didn't. Every fall like this has a structure around it. the advisors who saw it coming and said nothing, or said something, and were ignored. The institution that protected him long after protecting him stopped making sense. And underneath all of it, the man who built his entire fortune and his entire life around being extraordinarily good at exploiting exactly this kind of weakness in exactly this kind of person. To understand how Andrew fell, you actually have to understand the man who wrote the book 500 years before any of this happened, and why he understood power so completely. Because Machiavelli wasn't a theorist sitting in a comfortable study, imagining how power might work. He lost everything himself, the same way Andrew did, and that's exactly why he saw it coming. Let's go there next. Now here's part D, picking up directly from that line. In 1512, a man named Machiavelli lost his job, his freedom, and very nearly his life. He had spent 14 years as a senior official in the government of Florence, one of the most important cities in Europe, a man trusted with diplomacy, with military organization, with the kind of access that put him in rooms with kings and popes. And then the political winds in Florence shifted, the Medici family returned to power after years in exile, and Machiavelli, who had served the government they replaced, was removed from office immediately. That alone would have been a hard landing for most men. It got worse. In 1513, he was accused of conspiring against the new Medici government. He was arrested, imprisoned in the Bargello, and tortured using a method called the strappado, where a person's arms are tied behind their back and they're hoisted off the ground by a rope, putting catastrophic strain on the shoulders. He endured this not once but several times. He was eventually released, not because he was found innocent in any meaningful sense, but because there wasn't enough evidence to convict him formally, and because the political climate didn't require his execution to make its point. He was exiled to a small family farm outside the city, stripped of position, stripped of access, stripped of the life he'd spent over a decade building at the age of 43, with a wife and children to support and almost no income. He wrote to a friend during this period that he felt his fortune had abandoned him completely, that the world he understood, the world where his skills and his service meant something, had simply closed the door on him without explanation. This is the part almost nobody knows about the prince, and it changes everything about how you should read it. Machiavelli did not write a detached academic study of power. He wrote it from exile, broke, humiliated, watching from the outside as men with far less understanding of politics than he had occupied positions of influence he no longer had access to. He wrote it, by his own account, partly as an attempt to get noticed again, to prove to the Medici family that his knowledge was valuable enough to bring him back into service. He dedicated the book to Lorenzo de' Medici, practically begging to be useful again. It didn't work. He spent the rest of his life largely outside formal power, watching from a distance, writing about the mechanics of something he'd lost access to and never fully regained. Here's why that matters for everything we've discussed about Andrew. Machiavelli wrote about the fall of princes with such precision because he had fallen himself, and he spent the rest of his life dissecting exactly how it happened to him and to the rulers he'd observed up close during his career. He wasn't guessing. He'd lived the gap between having power and losing it, and he understood, better than almost anyone in his era, that the fall is never really about one bad moment. It's about a structure of decisions that someone either sees clearly or doesn't. Now look at the Medici family itself, the people who pushed Machiavelli out, because their own history runs almost as a mirror image of everything we've already covered with Andrew. The Medici had ruled Florence for generations through wealth, influence, and careful management of public perception, not through formal royal title. In 1494, 20 years before Machiavelli's exile, the Medici were thrown out of Florence entirely, in a popular uprising following years of resentment over their increasingly autocratic behavior. Piero de' Medici, who'd inherited the family's position, fled the city. The family that had effectively run Florence for 60 years lost everything almost overnight, the same way Andrew lost everything across 4 months in 2025 and 2026, despite decades of built-in protection. What's striking is how similar the underlying cause was. The Medici had spent years assuming their position was secure, because it always had been. They mismanaged a series of political and military crises, alienated allies they needed, and ultimately discovered that decades of accumulated goodwill evaporates extremely fast once a population decides the cost of supporting you has become too high. Sound familiar? They returned to power 18 years later, in 1512, the same year Machiavelli lost his position, through a mix of foreign military support and shifting political alliances. And one of the very first things the restored Medici government did was purge the previous administration's loyalists, Machiavelli among them, exactly the way King Charles, centuries later, moved to remove his brother once Andrew became too costly for the institution to keep protecting. The pattern is identical across 500 years, separated by completely different contexts. A figure with deep inherited or accumulated advantage assumes that advantage is permanent. A crisis arrives that the figure mismanages, often through years of small decisions rather than one dramatic mistake. The people and institutions around that figure, who absorbed the cost of protecting them for years, eventually reach the point where protecting them costs more than abandoning them. And the fall, when it finally comes, looks sudden to outsiders, even though it had been building for a decade or two. Now let's look at the people standing closest to Andrew throughout this entire collapse, because Machiavelli wrote extensively about exactly this kind of figure, and almost none of it has been part of the public conversation about this story. Start with the advisor who tried to stop the interview. Reporting from the time confirms that one of Andrew's official advisors resigned just before the Newsnight interview took place, specifically because they opposed it going ahead. This is a detail that gets mentioned briefly and then forgotten, but it matters enormously. Someone close enough to Andrew, someone with enough understanding of how this would likely be received, tried to prevent the single most damaging public moment of his entire life, and was either overruled or simply walked away rather than continue watching it happen. Machiavelli wrote at length about the value of an advisor willing to tell a prince the truth, and the much more common reality that princes surround themselves with people who tell them what they want to hear instead. He wrote that the wise prince actively seeks out a small number of advisors who will speak honestly and listens to them specifically on the matters where honesty is most uncomfortable. He also wrote that this only works if the prince actually acts on what he's told, because an advisor who is consistently ignored eventually stops bothering to give honest counsel at all, and either becomes a yes man or leaves entirely. Andrew had at least one advisor who saw the disaster coming clearly enough to resign in protest rather than be part of it. And the interview happened anyway, exactly as that advisor feared. Now look at the institution itself, the royal household, the network of officials and palace communications staff, whose entire job is managing exactly this kind of reputational risk for the family. For years, the public messaging strategy around Andrew followed a consistent pattern. Statements expressing sympathy for victims paired with continued institutional protection. Andrew's lawyers and representatives telling the public he was eager to cooperate with investigators, while the investigators themselves, on the record, said the opposite was true. This is not necessarily evidence of one villain pulling strings behind the scenes. It's closer to what Machiavelli describes as an institution managing a slow-burning crisis with short-term tools, hoping the problem resolves itself before the long-term cost becomes unavoidable. Machiavelli was specific about why this strategy almost always fails. He wrote that the prince, or in this case the institution, who tries to manage a serious threat with statements and reassurance instead of decisive action, ends up paying the cost of the threat anyway, plus an additional cost in credibility for having tried to manage it through words rather than action. Every reassuring statement issued on Andrew's behalf between 2019 and 2025 that didn't match the underlying reality, the cooperation that was promised but didn't materialize, the sympathy expressed for victims while the relationship with the institution remained otherwise intact, added to a credibility debt that eventually had to be paid all at once in October 2025, when there was no more room left to manage the situation quietly. And then there's Epstein himself, who deserves a more honest examination than he usually gets in stories focused on Andrew, because Epstein is the closest real-world example of a specific kind of operator Machiavelli wrote about with real fascination, not the prince. The man who never holds formal power himself, but who builds influence entirely through proximity to people who do. Machiavelli described this kind of figure in the context of advisors and courtiers who attach themselves to powerful people not to serve them, but to extract value from the relationship for as long as it remains useful. He wrote that the truly dangerous version of this figure is the one who is genuinely skilled at making the powerful person feel understood, valued, entertained, in a way their formal position rarely allows them to feel. That skill, Machiavelli wrote, is more dangerous to a prince than almost any external enemy, because the prince invites the danger in himself. voluntarily, often for years, without recognizing what's actually happening. Epstein built an entire operation around exactly this skill. Introductions to other powerful people, an environment that felt, to the people inside it, like an escape from the formality of their normal lives. By every account that has emerged since his 2019 death, this wasn't incidental to his crimes, it was the infrastructure that enabled them. A web of access and flattery that kept powerful people close enough and invested enough to look away from what was actually happening around them. Andrew was not unique in being drawn into that web. He was simply one of the most prominent people who never found their way back out of it, even after the warning signs had become undeniable to the rest of the world. Now let's bring this all the way back to you, because this is where the entire arc, A through D, actually lands. We've talked about the decision to stay close to risk after it becomes visible. We've talked about trusting your own version of events over the evidence in front of you. We've talked about building nothing independent of the one structure protecting you. We've talked about institutions that move slowly even when public sentiment has already decided the outcome. And now we've talked about the people around a falling figure, the advisor who sees it coming and is ignored, the institution that manages a crisis with words instead of action, and the operator who built an entire career exploiting exactly this kind of blind spot. Here's the actual exercise, the one Machiavelli would have wanted you to run on your own life, rather than just nodding along at someone else's. Look at the relationships in your life right now that exist primarily because of proximity to something else you value, a job, a social circle, a sense of importance you don't get anywhere else. Ask yourself honestly whether any of those relationships are ones you'd keep if the convenience disappeared tomorrow. If the answer is no, you already know something you've been avoiding acting on. Look at the explanations you've given yourself, or other people, for decisions that didn't go the way you expected. Ask whether you've actually tested those explanations against how they sound to someone with no reason to be generous toward you. Most people never do this. Most people only find out how their explanation actually sounded after it's already cost them something. Look at how much of your security, your income, your sense of identity exists independently of one person. One employer, one relationship continuing to think well of you. If the honest answer is not much, that's not a moral failing. It's just information. It tells you exactly where your own version of October 2025 is sitting, waiting for the moment it stops being held up. And look at who around you is willing to tell you something uncomfortable, and whether you've actually been listening when they do, or whether you've been quietly rewarding the people who tell you what you want to hear and tuning out the ones who don't. Machiavelli didn't write The Prince to help rulers feel better about themselves. He wrote it because he'd lost everything once, watched it happen to people more powerful than him both before and after his own fall, and wanted to leave behind an honest account of the mechanics, stripped of comforting illusions, so that someone, somewhere, reading it later, might recognize the pattern early enough to do something different. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor had 19 years of moments where a different decision was sitting right in front of him. Each one passed. The ending that arrived in 2025 and 2026 wasn't a betrayal, wasn't bad luck, wasn't a conspiracy by a brother trying to erase him. It was the final entry in a ledger that had been accumulating since 2006, and it came due exactly the way Machiavelli said it always does, all at once, after years of looking like it might never come due at all. The man who wrote the rules understood them because he'd broken them himself, watched himself pay for it, and spent the rest of his life making sure the lesson outlived him. It did. 500 years later, it explains a fallen prince's collapse almost line by line. The only real question left is whether it explains something in your own life too, and whether you're willing to look at it honestly enough to act before your own ledger comes due.